Welcome to today's Harvard Business Review webinar, Build an A-Team. I'm Julie Duvall, Marketing and Communications Director at Harvard Business Review, and I want to thank all of you for joining us today. And I want to thank SHL for making this discussion possible. What's the secret to having an engaged and productive team? It's having a plan for developing all employees, no matter where they are on their personal learning curves. Better morale and higher performance happen through learning, argues Whitney Johnson. In her over 20 years of coaching, investing, and consulting, Johnson has seen that employees need continuous learning and fresh challenges in order to stay motivated. The best bosses know this, and they know how to make it happen by thoughtfully designing people's jobs around the skills they have today, as well as the skills they'll need to be valuable tomorrow. That's how entire organizations stay competitive in an unpredictable, rapidly changing business environment. Whitney is with us today to explain how to build your A-team. She will discuss how to identify what leaders you have in place and what they need to learn next, how to bring your leaders and talent up to speed quickly, how to design jobs to maximize engagement and learning, and how to apply a 7-step process for leading each person up his or her learning curve. Recognized as one of the 50 leading business thinkers in the world by Thinkers 50, Whitney Johnson is an expert on disruptive innovation and personal disruption. She is the author of the critically acclaimed book, Disrupt Yourself, Putting the Power of Disruptive Innovation to Work, and her latest book, Build an A-Team, Play to Their Strengths and Lead Them Up the Learning Curve. Whitney, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here. I would like to start today by telling you 2 stories. Story number 1. Imagine that you have just gotten a call from a headhunter. It's for a job with a company that makes a product that was invented 60 years ago. At the time, it was an important invention. But since then, not much has changed. At the time, it helped keep rockets and missiles from rusting, but again, not much has changed, not even the label. So this is not a very flashy company. I want you to imagine for just a moment, you've gotten that call from a headhunter, and ask yourself, would I be interested? Would I want to take this call? Would I decide, yeah, this job sounds interesting to me? And I'm going to guess if you and I were sitting across the table from one another, you would say, yeah, not so much. What if the headhunter now tells you people they love to work at this company? Their engagement scores are 90% plus versus an average in the United States of 30% and internationally about 15%. So engagement scores are very, very high at this company. And then the headhunter tells you that the market cap over the last 20 years has increased from $250 million U.S. to $2 billion U.S., an 8-times increase, significantly outperforming the S&P 500. Now, it's a lot more interesting, right? Engagement scores are high, the market cap is growing. Not bad for a company that makes a can of oil. So that's story number 1. Now let me tell you story number 2. I am working on Wall Street. I've been an equity analyst, picking stocks, award-winning analyst, institutional investor ranked, but I've been doing it for a few years, so it's time for me to do something new. I go to my boss and say, I'd like it if you would sponsor me to make a move onto the management track. And I get the old, really, we like you right where you are. It's 2004. I've now read The Innovator's Dilemma, which is this kernel of an idea that this theory, or I've had this kernel of an idea that this theory of disruption that I read about in Innovator's Dilemma, that it's about products and services, that it also applies to people. If you want to move forward, you have to take a step back. So within a year, I quit my job and eventually went on to co-found the Disruptive Innovation Fund with Christensen. Now, what I want to do for just a moment is take those 2 stories that we talked about, put them into a parking lot. We'll come back to them and explain, what do I mean when I say disruptive innovation? It's a term we hear a lot, but what do I mean when I say it? At its simplest, It's a silly little thing that takes over the world, like the telephone did to the telegraph, like the automobile did to the horse and buggy. More recently, we've seen Toyota disrupt General Motors, Netflix disrupted Blockbuster, and now it's actually disrupting cable TV. Disruptive innovation, it follows a framework. The disruptor secures a foothold at the low end of the market. Think about Netflix in the 90s. Initially, its products were inferior, its position was weak. Blockbuster at that point in time could have absolutely crushed them, but they didn't. Market leaders rarely bother. It's just a silly little door-to-door DVD rental service. Let's go after bigger, higher margins, better. Bad news, or the good, depending on your point of view, is that once a disruptor gains a foothold, it too is motivated by bigger, better, stranger things, the crown, and so it goes. Personal disruption is how you take all of these ideas and make them meaningful to you. You start at the bottom of the ladder, you climb to the top, and then you jump to the bottom of a new ladder, like the children's game Chutes and Ladders. The big difference with personal disruption is that you're Toyota and your General Motors, your Netflix and your Blockbuster. You're the silly little thing, and you take over the world. Now, I suspect that many of you on the webinar today have to hold this tension because you're not a startup. It's not your first job. So the old and new have to coexist because you are disrupting you. Let's now go back to those two stories. So here I am. I'm working on Wall Street. It's one of the most exciting places in the world to work. And I leave. My experience, it wasn't singular. The experience that my boss was having, it's not uncommon. You as a boss want to be a place, a person that people want to work for. You need to. It's important to you to do. But then when you have budgets, you have deadlines, you have things you have to get done, there's this feeling that you need people right where they are, doing what they've always done. And so now there's this revolving door. It doesn't stop. You're probably the one pushing it. You're one your people are walking through. It's costing you time. It's costing you money. It's the innovator's dilemma. Whether you innovate or not, there's risk. But with people. So how do you stop that revolving door? Does this developing of people help you get more done? Does it lower your disruption score? How exactly do you solve this dilemma? Well, WD-40, that company that invented their product 60 years ago, that company whose label hasn't changed in those 60 years, that company that makes that product that stops things from squeaking, they have the answer. They allow, they encourage, they require you to disrupt yourself. When we interviewed the CEO, when we researched the company, we found out that 3 of their senior people, they started as a receptionist, and 1 is now the company brand manager. We discovered when we administered our disruption diagnostic that 60% of their people believe that they can achieve all of their career goals without ever leaving, so they stay. This is a company that develops their people through repeated personal disruption. They learn, they leap, and then they repeat. Now, because the squeaky wheel of an idea gets the grease, I'm going to tell you another story. Imagine for just a moment that you have sailed 200,000 miles, the distance from the Earth to the Moon, in a year when there is absolutely no GPS. What would it have been like to be the very first European to land in Sydney, Australia, to visit the Hawaiian Islands, to be one of the most famous explorers and map makers in history? We know from these explorations there are consequences. There always are with disruption. But what would it have been like 300 years ago to map nearly a third of the globe, and your maps are still in use 200 years later? But would it have been possible if there hadn't been a person willing to help another person learn? There was this young boy growing up in the early 1700s in Yorkshire, England. His family's poor, they're impoverished. But the lord of the local manor sees him as gifted, so he pays for school. When the city calls to him, a shipowner takes him on as an apprentice. And then after rising to the ranks in the merchant navy and disrupting himself to join the Royal Navy, an up-and-coming officer brings him along. Without these people who are willing to develop, willing to invest, willing to challenge, Captain James Cook may have wasted away, unaccomplished, unknown. Instead, he wrote in his journal, "I sailed farther than any other man before me." Star Trek fans will know that Captain James T. Kirk is modeled after Cook. He wants to boldly go where no man has gone before. This is what people want on the job. This is what the people who work for you want. This is what we all want, to boldly go where we haven't gone. And yet, we all like a little bit of predictability. If we could peek into a crystal ball, we would. And if we could take off in our starship full of dreams, well, then we might. So now we've got this conundrum because we know that it's learning, it's innovation that makes our organization a place where people want to work, where people want to work for you. But it also challenges you, requires you to iterate, to disrupt the current version of you. So this is where the S-curve comes in. It was popularized by E.M. Rogers in 1962. It looks a lot like a wave. At our Disruptive Innovation Fund with Christensen, we use the S-curve to help us gauge how quickly an innovation would be adopted. At the start or the base of the S, you know that growth is going to be slow until a tipping point is reached, or the knee of the curve, as you can see in front of you. And that's typically 10 to 15% penetration of the market. And then you enter hypergrowth. And then at 90% or saturation, the growth, it tapers off. As we were applying this S-curve for investing, I had this insight, this aha that's since become the basis for all of our work, the work that we did in Disrupt Yourself and the 7-point framework of personal disruption, the work that we're doing here around teams, is that this S-curve, this learning curve, also applies to people. The S-curve math tells you that when you start something new, when you start a new project, when you start a new role, when you start a new job, when you start a new company, you are at the base of the S, the bottom of the wave. Growth will be slow. It will feel like a slog, but knowing that helps you avoid discouragement. As you put in the effort, you accelerate into competence. With this comes confidence and engagement. And then as you approach mastery, things will be easy, but because you're no longer learning, you can get bored. So, question for you all. Let's do a poll. In your current role, in the project that you're on, where are you on your current S-curve? Are you at the low end? Are you in the middle? Are you at the high end? So low end is going to be a place where you've maybe been there 6 months, a year. It's like this big jumble of puzzle pieces, and you don't yet know how they all fit together. Lots of days where you're like, I'm not sure that this was the job I should have taken. You're at the low end of the curve, figuring things out, having to figure out how to put the pieces together. Are you in the middle where you know enough but not too much, everything's working? This is exactly where you should be right now. Things are hard but not too hard, easy but not too easy. Or are you at the high end where things are easy peasy, you've got it, but you're feeling just a little bit bored? Where are you on the S-curve in your current role, in your current job? Looks like we've got a few more coming in. All right. Oh, okay. So I'm going to start commenting because I think we've probably got enough data points that can give us an indication. It looks like about 50% of you are in the sweet spot of the curve. 27% of you are at the low of the curve where you're still figuring things out. and then about 21% of you are at the high end of the curve. Now, we're going to talk in just a minute about what that can look like and what that means and what the implications are for your team. And we're also going to talk about how you manage people along different points on the curve. But very interesting to see where you are in your current role on the learning curve, and we'll give you some guidance of what to do on that in just a second. Okay, so just a moment ago, I said that the S-curve of learning looks a lot like a wave. So let's look at a wave and see how it happens. Ocean waves are created by wind moving across the water, and it's the friction of the air molecules against the water molecules that transfers the energy from the wind to the water, and this is what causes the wave to form. Here's what's interesting, is that the water doesn't actually travel with the wave. The water just moves up and down. It's the energy that travels. It's the same with every individual. Whenever you start something new, you're at the bottom of the wave, and there's very little energy. But with the friction of a challenge, that energy starts to build until it peaks or crests and eventually crashes. Same water, same individual, different levels of energy. Just as an ocean is made up of many, many waves, your organization, your team, is a collection of learning curves. And what we've found in our research is that you build a high-performing team, a team that can innovate, a team that can manage through change by optimizing those curves. At any given time, you want to have about 70% of your people on the steep part, where they're very much engaged, they're very productive, they know enough, but again, not too much, not everything, but enough. You want 15% of your people at the low end of the curve, and we'll talk about why in just a moment, and you want 15% of your people at the high end of the curve. Now, let's do another quick poll. And this one's going to be harder because you're going to have to do it on the fly, but let me ask you a question. What percentage of your team right now is on the steep part of the curve? They've probably been in this role at least 6 months to a year, probably haven't been there longer than 3 to 4 years, and we'll talk about that more in a minute about why. But what percentage of your team would you say right now is in that steep part, where they're coming to work, they're engaged, they do need some direction, but not a lot. They're able to give input, but they're still not masters and experts at what they do. What percentage of your people would you say are in the steep part of the curve right now? See what we've got. Okay. About 63% of you are saying less than 60%. All right. 32% are saying 60 to 80%. All right. Let's have that poll keep going while I give you a little bit more commentary that I think you will find interesting. One of the things that people sometimes wonder is, well, okay, everything's been going really well with my team and with my organization, but how do I know if I'm potentially at risk of being disrupted, that the competitors are kind of nipping at my heels? How do I know? Well, one of the ways that you can do and take a look at this is it's a shorthand way, but take the pulse of your workforce. If you have too many people, too high of a percentage of your people at the high end of the curve, then you know that you're at risk. Why? Because people at the high end of the curve are bored. They're no longer enjoying the feel-good effects of learning. They're starting to dial in. They don't mean to, but because they're bored, they're either going to leave or they're going to get complacent. And bored and complacent doesn't disrupt, it doesn't innovate, they get disrupted. All right, so that gives you something to think about as you think about your team. And one of the things I want you to be doing is you're just taking this poll. You might even get out a piece of paper, draw that S on a piece of paper, and kind of map it out right now. What percentage of your people are on the steep part of that curve? What percentage are at the low end? What percentage are at the high end? And we're going to talk again in just a minute about why you want to optimize those various percentages. Once you've done that, once you've got a clear picture of where your flock or bevy of S-curves is, it's time to load balance those curves, to practice personal disruption, to create that cadence of learn, leap, and repeat. So recapitulating very quickly before we proceed, every person in your organization is on a learning curve, including you. You build a high-performing organization by recognizing that you're a collection of those learning curves, and you want to have, at any given time, 70% of your people on the steep part where they're engaged, 15% of your people at the low end, and 15% of your people at the high end. This is the S-curve of learning framework at a very, very high level. Now, the question is, how do you execute this S-curve strategy? We talked about it at a high level, but how do you execute this? How do you manage people at different points along the curve? And more specifically, how do you manage your 15% of your people at the low end of the curve? Here are 3 suggestions. Number 1, you want to actually have people on your team at the low end of the curve. You want to hire for potential, not for proficiency. Let me explain what I mean by that by taking you to a place called Butte, Montana. It is known as one of the richest, or actually the richest hill on earth. In the mid-1800s, miners went to Butte, Montana. It attracted miners. They were panning for gold and silver. But the early rush, it disappointed, and so many of those miners sold off their claims for dirt cheap. The next round of miners discovered copper. At the time, copper was not valuable, nowhere nearly as valuable as silver and gold. But as technology advanced and electrical wiring became a thing, copper became extremely valuable. And so those patient miners are now known as the copper kings. I often think of Butte, Montana when people say to me, oh, I can't find anybody to hire. Well, they're looking for the gold standard, the top of the curve expertise. But what about copper? There are very compelling reasons to go for copper, to hire for potential, not for proficiency. Let me explain why, or give you an example. So I'm working with a company. It's a growth stage company. They're in a very hot market. Engineers are in a lot of demand. But it turns out that engineers 3 years out of school are in high demand. So top of the curve expertise, the gold standard. No one wants to hire recent graduates. No one wants to hire the copper. But for a company who's willing to hire that copper, in 3 years' time, when everyone else starts mining for that gold because they hired at the low end of the curve, allowed those engineers to learn, they are now loyal. Yes, of course, there will still be a revolving door, but it will move much, much more slowly. When you hire for potential, it's like buying low and then you sell high. So that's the first suggestion. The second suggestion is to have a plan. Whenever we hire people, we subconsciously believe that we are hiring this person into this exact role forever, a one true employee. But they can't, they shouldn't, they won't stay here forever. So you want to have a plan for their 6 months along the curve, a plan for their 2 to 3 years in the sweet spot, and a plan for their 6 months to a year at the high end of the curve before you, yes, you, I'm looking at you, pretend, help them jump to a new curve. Remember, time plus competence equals boredom. Now, the third suggestion is to value their inexperience. So at the low end of the curve, and I'm not talking about just people who are straight out of school. You can be inexperienced as a brand new CEO. When you're at the low end of the curve, you're inexperienced. There's lots of things you don't know how to do yet. And so it can be, sometimes you get a little bit impatient. But because you're at the low end of the curve, because you're not blind through familiarity, you are capable of asking questions like, why do you do it like this? Why do you do it like this? What often happens when people ask those questions is we get annoyed. We think, oh, you don't know anything, just go do your work. Or we feel threatened because it feels like they're saying, why do you do it like this? And yet, if you think about it, those are the questions that open the door to innovation, which is why you need 15% of your people at the low end of the learning curve. So let's discuss this for a couple of minutes. Who on your team is at the low end of the learning? You might not want to actually list the name, but think about it. Who on your team is at the low end of the learning? Are there why do we do it like this questions welcome? And more broadly, let's discuss this for a minute or two and see, Julie, what comes in is what insights are you having about being at the low end of the curve, either for you individually realizing, oh, that's why I go home every day from work thinking, what am I doing here? It's because I'm at the low end of the curve. Or that's why I'm impatient with this person. Or, oh, now I understand that I've got to have a plan from day one because they will jump to a new learning curve. And so if I want to be a great boss, I'm going to help them manage that learning curve. What thoughts, what insights, what questions do you have at this point? And Julie, I'll turn it over to you to see what's coming in.
Sure. While we wait for questions to come in, we did have one back at an earlier slide around what happens when people just get comfortable and they're happy where they are in the curve and they don't want to move up or across. They're just really happy with what they're doing. Does that harm the business? How do we think about that?
Oh, that's a great question. If you can hold that question for just a moment, we will talk about that once we get to the top of the curve. So just hang on to that, and I promise I will come back to it. So
All
at
right.
the top of the curve, let me just make a note, top of the curve, when they don't want to move and they're feeling pretty comfortable there. Is that the question?
That
Julie?
is the question, yes. Yep.
Okay, we will absolutely come back to that when we get to the top of the curve. What else is coming in?
There is a question, actually a lot of people are asking about the top of the curve. I know we're coming back to it, but what's the stage after mastery stage? And I think you are going to talk about this, about jumping curves, but do you have any quick insights before we move on?
Yeah, so again, we'll talk about more. That's so interesting that all of you are focused on the top of the curve. I wonder if there are a lot of you at the top of the curve. So once you're at the top of the curve, there are some things that you can do to extend out that curve to push yourself back into the sweet spot. Also, you sometimes have to jump to the bottom of a new curve. So we'll talk more about that in a minute. It's interesting that that's really where your focus is. So if there aren't any other questions about the low end, shall we keep going? Anything else you're seeing, Julie?
No, we can move on.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so now that you have the momentum of that S-curve starting to build, which our research says is going to take you somewhere between 6 months and a year, and people graduate into the sweet spot, now what do you do? What do you do with that 70% of your people who are on that steep part of the curve? Now, if you look again at the math, you'll realize is at the low end of the curve, there was a lot of time that was passing and very little was happening. But once you get into the steep part of the curve, in a little time, a lot happens. And so it's very easy for us as a manager to say, they're doing great, I'll just leave them be, which is precisely what they do not need. And let me give you 3 reasons why. Some of you may have seen or heard of the film Jaws. Well, what you may not know is that the most iconic, the most famous scenes in this film came about because the mechanical shark that Steven Spielberg wanted to use, it did not work. So here he is, he's now over budget, he's behind schedule, and he finally realizes, I'm going to have to shoot the scenes differently. And so he shoots them from the shark's point of view and says, I'll let the music and everybody, I'm pretty sure you can sing it in your head right now, and our imagination do the rest. Second example, there was a post-mortem done of 200 failed startups, and they divided them into funded and unfunded startups. Funded startups are the ones that went out, they raised outside capital, had plenty of cash on hand. The bootstraps are the ones that they had to just generate their own they had to build their business based on the cash flow that they could generate by running the business day to day. The number one reason that the funded startups went out of business, the number one reason was that they ran out of cash. Ironic, right? Especially because it was only the number 10 reason for the bootstrap startups. Third example, skateboarders. They are some of the quickest learners in the world because they receive incredibly fast and very useful feedback. Every action, every move has an immediate consequence. So the question is, skateboarders, Spielberg, startups, successful in spite of or because of their constraints? As your sweet spotters gain momentum, they need more challenges, more constraints, more friction. Remember the wave? It was the friction that caused the wave to form. How does a fighter pilot become a successful entrepreneur? Friction. Alana Golan, she was a fighter pilot in the Israeli army. She retires from the military. She goes to work at Intel in Israel. She's the low end of the curve. She's an intern. But she's also been a fighter pilot, training a lot of other fighter pilots. So her boss, Ziad Hana, he gives her a stretch assignment. Her friction that he created was she needed to develop verification tools to test quality of software. She starts in academia and actually stalls a bit. It was a risk giving her this assignment. That's what a stretch assignment is. There is the real risk of failure. But then, because he was willing to help her learn, he helped her, guided her to a startup in Sweden that could work. So she analyzes it, builds a prototype, she tests it, and they eventually acquire that startup. And Intel used it for, or the software, the technology, for decades. As your people gain that momentum, they need challenges. I recently had one of my coaching clients say to me about one of his people, he's like, she's a rock star. And my question was, are you pushing her? More challenges, more constraints, more friction. That's how you get innovation. And that's why you need 70% of your people on the steep part of the curve. And then don't forget to appreciate them. Don't forget to appreciate them. They're not the problem child. So don't make them one by ignoring them. So the two pieces of advice for people on the steep part of the curve, you want 70% of your people here. I would argue that once you're in that steep part, you're all high potential, is give people stretch assignments, and number one, appreciate them. Question for you now, what are some of your insights around steep part of the curve? Are you currently on the steep part? You said, a number of you, that you've got a lot of people on the steep part of the curve. Are you giving them enough challenges? Are you giving them stretch assignments? Are you helping them figure out what they're made of? The research has said that we sometimes don't give people who we consider high potential a stretch assignment because we're afraid that they'll fail. And then when we're afraid that they'll fail, then they're not stretched and then they start to actually fail. But not because we didn't give them the stretch assignment, but because we undermine their confidence. And are you appreciating people? One thing you can do today, I would encourage you to do, is send a text, send an email, have a conversation, and be very sincere and in praise of something someone has done on your team recently. Anything coming in, Julie? Any comments, any insights?
Yeah, people are chatting away, and while we wait for them to come in, I actually have a good question from someone, and I know you address this in the book, so I'm going to ask it. So when you're teaching and helping people move up, how do you deal with the employees who are fear failure? And I know you have a section about that on the book, so do you want to tell us how that works?
Yeah, I think that's a great thing to talk about right now. So one of the things that we, and you talked a little bit earlier about failure, or not failure, but the 7-point framework for personal disruption. We're not going to go through that today. That's in the book, Disrupt Yourself. But one of the points of moving along a learning curve is to give failure its due. And so a couple of thoughts I have around failure. Number one is that if you think about disruption, the up and down are involved. Failure always happens. It's going to happen. And if you think about your life, you've had lots of failures. I've had lots of failures. I've bombed speeches in front of hundreds of people. I've been fired. I've backed a business that imploded. And like the speech that bombed, like they didn't like it, they hated it. I have all the comment cards to prove it. When I was fired, I was devastated. I thought I would never recover. So like failure happens. It happens to me. It happens to you. And I think that we sometimes think that failure is what limits disruption. Failure is what limits innovation, but it's not actually the failure that's the problem. We all have had failures, lots of failures every single day where it's not an issue at all. It's the shame that comes. And so it's shame that limits disruption, not failure. So what I would say to you is, to the extent that it's your own shame, then there's inner work that you need to be doing in order to ditch that shame, because that shame will be this albatross that pulls you down that curve all the time. You've got to figure out how to ditch that, and so that you can iterate and move and have those failures move you forward. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that there are people on your team that may be afraid to fail. It's probably a shame thing, but it's also they may be afraid to fail because they're afraid that you won't have their back. And so one of the things, because you're afraid to fail, because we're all afraid of that, but one of the things or conversations that you can have to frame this is to say something like this: there is something that I want to give this person to do. It's a stretch assignment. We all know for the business it makes sense for us to do this. It's the right business decision. It's the right developmental tool for this individual. But the reality is that there's only a 70% chance it's going to work, or a 60% chance, or 80, whatever. There's a 20, 30, 40% chance it's not going to work. If it doesn't work, we're going to learn a lot. We will have there will be an ROI on this failure. We will still develop this person. But if it doesn't work, will you have my back? Will you back me? What that does is that frames it up. It frames the expectations in such a way that you're going to back the person who works for you, but you're also creating a space for the people who work for you to be able to innovate and fail because you know that your boss is going to have your back. You've also then framed it out so that it isn't, yes, no, 100% or 0%. There's this wonderful gray area and lots of learning that can take place, even if it doesn't work as you had expected. So recapping very quickly, it's not typically failure that's the problem, it's the shame, and so we have to look at that for ourselves individually, look at it for the people who work for us. Oftentimes when they failed, what they need more than anything is a CEO, a chief encouragement officer to say, okay, what did you learn? Now get back up, put on your big boy, put on your big girl pants, and keep going. And then we, as a boss, we create a space for that by framing out expectations so that there is space for people to make mistakes and learn, et cetera.
That's great.
That was a long answer, but I hope it was a good
fine. You're definitely resonating. There are a ton of questions coming in, but I think because people are recognizing themselves on various parts of the curve, what do you do if you have a manager who just doesn't buy into this? What are some of the ways that you can start to have these conversations with your manager?
Yeah, so let me give you a very short answer, and I think we'll be able to answer this more as we go along. But the short answer is that the manager may not be buying into this because they just don't know about it. And so one of the simple conversations you can have is say, I learned something really interesting. Like, we're all on these learning curves. It looks a lot like a wave or a roller coaster. And we know from the neuroscience is that at the very bottom, we're not going to know what we're doing, and then we start to know what we're doing in the sweet spot, and so we're enjoying that dopamine that's coming with learning, and so we're very, very engaged. But we also know from the neuroscience that when we get to the top, we may not be enjoying that as much. And so now what's happened is we've got this latent innovation potential, and I may not be as much value right now unless I have a new stretch assignment. I don't necessarily need to change roles or jobs, but I need a way to push me so that I can really contribute to the organization in a meaningful way. And the second thing I would say to you is it may be that your boss doesn't get it, but if you manage people, you can start with where you are. And there are lots of ways to do that simply by starting to outline for the people who work for you that they're on a learning curve. I'll give you one other example. I can tell this is there's so much to talk about. I had a person, he's a CTO. He had a person on his team. You could tell, he's feeling a little bit bored, not sure what to do here, showed him the S-curve, and said, all right, I know you're bored. What do you want to do? And the guy goes, well, I think I'd like to try X, Y, Z. And afterwards he said, you just S-curved me, didn't you? But they had the conversation. So now the guy knows, okay, here's what we need to do. So if you can start to explain this to your boss in very simple ways, but more importantly, build out proof points with your own team, then you're able to start to manage up. I'm going to have to stop there, although I could go on for many more minutes. But we probably should continue, Julie, so that we get through all the content. Okay. All right. So let's see. Okay. Now we're getting to the point. The question that everybody had is the top of the curve. What do we do there? Because as you have all surmised or certainly implied, this is where our problem children come in. Why? Because you're at the top of the curve. You've worked hard. You have this person. They're your go-to person. Why would you push them to do something new? You like them right where they are, where they do you the most good. But this is the danger zone. Just a few minutes ago, I said that the typical duration of a learning curve, or I implied, is that it's about 4 years. And if you look back at your career, beginning with high school, you'll see that this is the case. But there are ways to extend out that curve, to stay in the sweet spot longer. And sometimes you'll need to, because for whatever reason, you can't jump to a new curve. There's lots of reasons why, but sometimes you can't. But here are 3 things that you can do. The first is that you can jump in place. What do I mean when I say you can jump in place? Well, you can get a coach. You can study your industry, even if it's for 15 minutes a day. You study how to be a better leader, like you're doing today, by the way. And that is how Gary Ridge, the CEO that I talked to you earlier about, the CEO of WD-40, he has been able to, because he continually is learning how to be a better leader, been effective as a CEO of WD-40 for 20 years. Another way that you can elongate out that curve, is you can become a master to the apprentice. In our research, we met a former tech CEO who had been sitting on the board of a company, a growth stage startup, and he came off the board, which is highly unusual, to become the chief operating officer. Not because he's gunning for the top job as a CEO. He's he's been a CEO, but because he wants to develop people and he realizes the best way to do that is in the trenches. So a master with an apprentice, it's a whole new curve. Now, the third option for stretching out the curve, it's a stretch assignment. I recently, or earlier this year, I spoke at SAP in India where I met Sumit Shetty, and I think he's actually on here today, so you can chime in if I get your story wrong, Sumit. Sumit's an engineer. He's a mid-level manager at SAP, and he inherits a team. They're at the top of the curve. They don't necessarily want to jump, and he can't make them jump. So this goes to the question that some of you have asked earlier. He can't make them jump, but what he can do is he can make them stretch right where they are, in place. So his team, they needed to give a presentation to senior management. And instead of having them prepare for that presentation the way they always had, he had them practice and practice and practice and practice some more. And they complained. But when the presentation went well, at the end of the year, they listed this presentation, this experience, as one of their highlights. To be clear, just because a person has been on a curve for a long time does not necessarily mean they're at the top. The real metrics are they engaged? If they are, then they're still in the sweet spot. And, well, actually, let me back up. Are they still working for you is the first question. But then the second question is, are they engaged? Because if they're engaged, they're still in the sweet spot. Are they engaged? Are they lowering your disruption score? Or are they disengaged and raising that? All that said, if you've got a person who is at the high end of the curve and nothing is changing, this is the danger zone. And based on our research, you've got 6 months to a year before your plateau becomes a precipice. Okay, now I'm going to answer that question before we continue. The question of what do you have people when you're at the top of the curve? There are a couple of things you can do. Number one, I just said you can give them a stretch assignment where you push them to try something new right in the role exactly where they are. The other thing that you can do is have a conversation with them. Explain to them this S-curve of learning. Have the conversation. You've been in this role a long time. You've mastered it. You're very good at what you're doing. I would love to have you mentor people, but I also recognize that there is a lot of latent potential in you that is going unexploited, undeveloped. Now, this is not me trying to get rid of you. To be clear, this is me saying, you got a lot more horsepower in you, and we want to see that happen. I had this company. Here's what they did. Person, top of the curve. They've been in this role for more than 10 years. Chief marketing officer. What they did is they had them jump to the bottom of a new curve, not sending them away. This is a person like in their late 50s, early 60s, and have them running a startup initiative inside of their organization. So it's important. This is not me putting you out to pasture. This is not me getting rid of you. This is me saying, I want to see what else you got in you. I know you have more. I need you to jump to a brand new learning curve. If they don't want to do that, you can start by giving them a stretch assignment. All right. I'm going to keep going so that we get through everything. This is so fun. I love that you're asking all these questions. Okay. So mountain climbers will tell you that any altitude above 26,000 feet is the death zone. You are so high up, your brain and body start to die. You start to die. Anybody who has been at the top of the learning curve for too long, their brain and their body, it's not the danger zone, it's the death zone. Their brain and body will literally start to die. Don't let them die. Help them jump. All right. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to keep going. I'm going to skip over this next poll, but here's what I want you to think about. I'm going to skip it, but I want you to give this some consideration. When was the last time you helped someone jump to a new learning curve? Was it last month, last year, last 5 years? Never. All right. Bruce Lee, one of the greatest martial artists ever. He was also a brilliant teacher. People would come to him and say, teach me. So he'd take them out to a gym, and he would see what they know, and then he'd bring them back inside, and he'd sit them down, and he'd have them point the glass of Coke, and he'd say, this is what you know, this is what you believe to be the truth. And then he'd point them to a glass of water. Picture me, I've got my right hand on a glass of water, and he'd say, this is what I know, this is the truth, this is what you want, but I can't give it to you because there's too much of yours. However, if you're willing to let go of some of your knowledge, again, picture that glass of Coke, to make room for more, then we can work together. But if you hold on to this knowledge, then I can't help you. Are you prepared to empty your cup? If you are, here's what you need to know. Research done by Boris Groysberg at Harvard. He surveys small and medium-sized businesses every year over a decade and asks them to rate themselves on 20 different HR, actually more than 20 different HR practices. 2018 did the survey. Survey comes back. Of the 20 different HR practices, 450 companies, the one with the third lowest score was developing high potential. And again, I argue if you're on the steep part, you are all high potential. The one with the lowest score, lowest score, this year was not unusual, was job rotations. Why is it that we are so bad at letting people jump to new curves? Well, there's logic to it, and this goes to some of the objections that you might have as you're trying to think about this inside of your organization. Number one, why would I move a star performer to a new role? They're doing me so much good right here. Why would I let them move? Second objection, why would I hire for potential versus experience? I can get the gold standard. I can afford the gold standard. Why would I take copper? Third objection, how could an underperformer in one role, maybe because of the top of the curve or just in the wrong role, be a standout in another? So if you're thinking, I want to stop the revolving door, I want to be a boss that people want to work for, I want to be a talent magnet, I want to lower my disruption score, the trick is, here's the trick, you have to make it scarier not to change. Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize, loss aversion theory. He and Amos Tversky tell us that we're more motivated by what we lose than by what we gain. We're more motivated by what we lose than by what we gain. So what does that mean? Well, we have to make it scarier not to change. Here's what you're going to lose if you don't let people jump to new curves. You're going to lose your high performers. If you try to leave them where they are, they're going to leave you where you are. Number two, even if they do stay, because they're not learning, they're not going to be engaged. Number three, if they're not engaged, they're not going to innovate. And if they don't innovate, you, as an organization, as a team, will lose to faster adapting competitors. Now that you've hit yourself over the head with a stick of what you will lose, let's try this carrot of a story of what you will gain. Imagine you are a VP, one of 25, at a company with 6,000 people. That's what the top of the curve looks like for Dan Shapiro at LinkedIn. He studied mathematics and statistics in college. He went to business school. He worked at Bain & Company for a few years. And then in 2008, he started at LinkedIn in operations. By 2010, he's at the top of a curve. He jumps to the bottom of a new curve in sales. 2013, he's at the top of another curve in sales. He's gone from $10 million in revenue to $1 billion. Yes, it's a rocket ship. 8 reports to 1,000 reports. He has a meeting with the CEO. It's a victory lap, he thinks, where he shares his dream of someday becoming a tech CEO himself. The CEO says to him, if that's your dream, you're in the wrong job. People don't move from sales to product. And in fact, a tech CEO needs to be a product person. So you can't get there from here. Completely deflated, Dan Shapiro, and I suspect he thought about that revolving door, he deliberates for about 2 months. And then he comes back and he says, okay, let's build great products. What? Like, wait, I don't get this. You have $1 billion line of business. You have 1,000 employees, and now you want to be an individual contributor for engineers and no guarantees? Based on the data, and LinkedIn has a lot of data, people don't move from from sales to products, but Dan Shapiro did. He says there are parts he was terrible at. He was at the low end of the curve, but there were parts he was amazing at. Today, he's the top of another curve. Again, a VP, $2 billion business, sales and products report to him. Impressive. It's impressive, right? But you know what's even more impressive to me is that they let him. They let him do this because it was a risk. It was a risk for Dan. It was a risk for his family. Honey, I shrunk my role today. A risk for his boss, for his boss's boss, for the organization. But the decision to step back, the decision to become a silly little thing was a slingshot. the best reward, the thing that motivates beyond money, beyond praise, is the opportunity to learn. We're learning machines. We want to not know how to do something, to figure it out, to master it, and start all over again. Okay, we've got like a minute or two for any insights that you have before we go into our final remarks for the day. Any thoughts, any questions, Julie, that I absolutely need to answer?
Yes, I think one that a lot of people have had is, as team leaders, they have seen employees on their team who are, regardless if they're at the beginning or the end of the curve, they just are unwilling to learn, or they don't want to take on new projects. What do you do in that situation?
Okay, so it's a great question. I would find out why. Why are they unwilling to learn, and why are they don't want to take on new projects? Because oftentimes, and we talked about this earlier, is that there's some type of fear. So if someone says to you, I don't want to take this on, ask why. Employ the 5 whys. Why, and why. So you can eventually get to the real reason why. Because oftentimes we think, oh, they're just being X, Y, or Z. We project onto them we make up some story. And so if we know why they don't want to, then we can start to address it. If they're scared, then we can be that chief encouragement officer and help them be less scared. If they just don't want to, and they're stubborn and recalcitrant, that's when you might want to consider doing some type of stretch assignment where you push them to develop, and then they make a decision, either I'm going to develop, or they decide to leave because it's not fun for them anymore. And so that's where I would start, is to figure out why they're unwilling to do it. Because once you know why, then you can actually, the root cause, you can start to address it. So that's the starting point.
Great.
Okay, let's go to the final remarks then. Why don't you take a look at this loaf of bread? It's freshly baked, straight out of the oven, and in the northern hemisphere, it's winter time, so it's a good time to be making bread. The smell is wafting throughout your household, beckoning you to the kitchen. You put your hand on the bread, it's still warm. You pick up a knife, you slice it, then you put that bread in your hand, you cradle it, you slather it with butter and homemade strawberry freezer jam or honey or apricot jam, whatever your favorite kind is, and then you take a big bite. We bake bread, then we break bread. It releases oxytocin. It's a beautiful experience as we come together. Bread needs enough yeast and water and sugar in order to rise. If it doesn't rise long enough, you get what the pioneers called hardtack. If you let it rise too long, it collapses. Bread needs attention, but not too much. Part of the magic is that it does a lot of the work on its own. Just as it's possible to bake that perfect loaf of bread, to be a baker, it's possible for you to build an ideal team to be a maker. You start with the raw ingredients, you hire for potential. In order for people to rise, you challenge them, need them, appreciate them, and once they've risen, before they collapse, you give them something new to do. Whether you lead a team of 10 or 10,000, you are in a position to help people rise. But leading people up the learning curve is always the kind of thing, oh, it's easier to do tomorrow. Today isn't the day for people to jump. Today I have deadlines. Today I need people right where they are. Today I am busy. But for the best leaders, the best bosses, today, December 13th, 2018, today is the day. Because building a great team, building an A team, isn't just about personal disruption. It's about you as a leader who has the power. You as a leader have the power to help people go where they haven't gone, to live their best lives. Regardless of what your boss does, you have that power. A leader who can be a lighthouse providing safety and support for each and every S-curve wave, a harbor for their ship full of dreams. The best bosses, they don't build just one A-team. They build vast networks of A-teams across oceans, across careers, across companies, and across lives. One final quote. We are very near to greatness. One step, and we are safe. Can you not take the leap. Thank you. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Julie.
Thank you, Whitney. One of the things that has come up about lateral moves, people are asking, that seems to be ways where people can learn. And I'm going to throw out something that I found provocative in Build an A-Team, where you actually say that sometimes backward moves can be a way for people to be engaged. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you think about disruption, it's all about moving down and then slingshotting forward. The slope of your line is steeper. And so a backward step, and I'll give you one from my own career. I was working in investment banking on Wall Street, and there was a merger, and then there was a shakeup, and my boss was fired, and I was actually moved. But really, I was shoved into equity research. If you go from banking to equity research, that's what it feels and looks like. But it turned out that step back, for me, I wasn't disrupting myself. I was disrupted. Turned out to be a career maker because I was much better. I built the financial models. I was a very good stock picker. And so one of the things for you all to think about in your own careers is that you can disrupt yourself, and sometimes you can get disrupted, but that step back can oftentimes be a slingshot forward. In fact, I believe that sometimes we get fired, we lose our jobs. 10 to 50% of the workforce loses a job every year. Sometimes we get fired, we lose our jobs because we're at the top of a curve, and we know it's time for us to jump, and we won't do it, and so the universe pushes us off so that because we're afraid, and so pushes us off to do something new. So yeah, those backward moves can sometimes be incredibly effective at getting us to really disrupt ourselves and slingshot our careers and our lives forward.
It's great. One other thing you talk about, and I've actually experienced this myself as a team leader, what do you do about the employees that are hungry for more? They're constantly hungry, wanting to grow. They think their promotion is every 6 months. And a lot of companies aren't organized that way. And, it is, you want to keep them happy, but it's hard to keep them moving. Do you have any advice for managers that might be facing that?
Yeah, a couple of things. So I think if you can lay out that learning curve for people, it's helpful. And sometimes what's happening is that we hire people into the sweet spot, or we hire people at the high end of the curve, and so then the shelf life is very short. You've hired them at the high end of the curve. You've got 6 months, and they're going to be bored out of their mind. And so one of the ways that you can counteract that is to be willing and find ways to hire people at the lower end of the curve. Another thing that you can do is have them take the S-curve of learning and take that for themselves, so they're taking responsibility for their own learning. So we've got that diagnostic. If you go to my website, whitneyjohnson.com/diagnostic, you can download this S-curve. You can take it. You people on your team can take it. You have them take it. You then sit down and say, okay, here's where I think you are on the curve. Let's now talk about where you think you are and where I think you are, and try to get those two to match. The other thing that I would say to people is when they start to get antsy and want to be doing more, sometimes they're overestimating what their abilities are, and so that's having that conversation can help you get on the same page with respect to their abilities. The third thing that I would say, and this is a conversation, is that I see this sometimes in very hot markets where there are professions or expertise that's in a lot of demand. People will just start to move into the sweet spot, and then they'll have someone come chase them with more money, and then they'll move to a new place, and then they'll be at the bottom, and they'll start to move at the sweet spot. And so what ends up happening is they're jumping to lots of new curves, and they're making more money. But from a developmental perspective, their development is getting arrested. And so one of the things you can do is have that conversation with your folks. And you can say to them, this is the final piece of advice I would give, is sometimes if you've got a really high potential, high performing person, like I need more, they'll say to you, but I've got all this grunt work and I just don't have time to engage and do this other project. What I would say to them is, I'm going to give you the stretch assignment, but part of your stretch assignment is figure out how to, whatever you say your grunt work is taking you 50% of the time, I want you to innovate around how do you make that grunt work take 25% of your time, either through technology or you find ways to remap what you're doing, delegate to someone else, and so that they're innovating around the part of the job that they have to do so there's more time for them to get creative. And then if you're really clear with them contractually, or not contractually, but sort of informally contractually, once you do these three things, then I will help you jump to a new curve. Then they know that you are very invested in them, and it's not just about you trying to get a job done for you.
That's great, Whitney. Thank you so much. I'm afraid we are out of time, but this has been a great presentation. I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and I want to thank SHL for making this possible. This concludes our presentation. Have a great day.